Texas going to be the favorite, and you've been covering the league for a long time, and this is the first time you have taken the leap. You've done it. You have picked the Longhorns to win the Big 12 for the first time since you've been covering the conference. What all led to that decision?
So a couple things. One, when I looked at the All Big 12 team, when I looked at the people who I picked for awards, I mean, just a lot of Texas guys popped up there, right? I mean, you're talking about potentially the best receiver in the conference in Xavier Worthy. You're talking about an offensive lineman in Kelvin Banks, who's going to be a first-round pick whenever he's draft eligible. You're talking about a defender at linebacker in Jalen Ford, who I think might be the best defender in the whole conference. I think they've added some really key transfers. A.D. Mitchell from Georgia at receiver. Isaiah Neer is going to be back for them as well, somebody who was going to contribute last season before he got hurt. I just think that they have the combination of experience with a second-year quarterback coming back, consistency on the coaching staff, high-end talent, guys who I think are legit NFL players like Kelvin Banks, Jatavian Sanders at tight end, Jalen Ford at linebacker, like I mentioned. And I think enough of their questions are answerable with guys that I see on the roster who I have high hopes for than I do any other team. Now, look, the thing is, I have them going 7-2 in conference. I have 3 or 4 teams going 6-3. This is going to be a fight to the very end. This is not Texas gliding above the rest of the conference necessarily. But when I look at the other teams that I considered to be that top spot in the Big 12, Kansas State, of course, was one I had to consider. Texas Tech, I think, has a lot of upside, certainly Oklahoma. These are all teams that I see much more devastating flaws that I think could derail their seasons. So part of this is what I think Texas can do. And part of it also is that I don't see obvious competition that on paper, and that's all we have right now, should be able to compete with what they have. And this is a leap. Like you mentioned, I've covered the Big 12 since 2013, and I've never picked them to win the league. And so I understand the magnitude of what I'm picking here. They haven't done it since 2009. And you look at all the teams that have done it since 2009. But I think that they just have the least questions. And a big part of this, too, is frankly, if they don't make it to the Big 12 title game, if they don't win the league this year, I mean, I can't say it's anything except a failure for what they have and what they bring back and what they've been able to build over the past couple of years.
Now, one of the interesting picks in there is I've started to see this gain some steam across the country, that Texas is going to go into Tuscaloosa and beat Alabama, something that is very, very rare. And, I agree, Texas is going to have a nice roster coming back, but their roster isn't close to what Alabama's is. How did you come to the conclusion that Texas is going to go down there and beat Nick Saban's team?
So when you look at Texas, right, you look at a team that gets up for big games and does not get up for medium games. And even last year, I think Alabama was a better team last year and Texas was a worse team last year. And Texas should have won that game. Now, it was in Austin. Going to Tuscaloosa is another story. But that happened, right? They were able to compete from a roster perspective enough. The other part of this is, to an extent, fading Alabama from my perspective. They lose Bryce Young at quarterback, who was, if he wasn't the best player in college football over the last 2 years, he was top 3. And they're replacing him with, I don't know what at this point. Jalen Milroe started games for them, but the fact that they had to bring in a transfer at quarterback and Ty Buckner is just very concerning to me. It tells me that they're not happy with what they've got on the roster. I don't see sort of dynamic guys at the skill positions who are going to be Alabama level game changers like we've seen in the past. And defensively, obviously, they're working through the loss of Will Anderson, and Dallas Turner is going to be a really good player for them. But I don't know that I see a surefire Alabama team. And I see a Texas team that should be not just better, but it should be pretty significantly better than they were last season. They've got a second-year quarterback coming in. I think that's a huge part of it. And again, this team gets up for big games. That's been in Texas DNA for several years. I'm worried about, again, people were asking me, how do you pick Texas to beat Alabama and then lose to Houston? And I'm like, have you watched Texas over the last 10 years? That's what they do, right? I mean, they win the Notre Dame game and then go 5-7. That's what happens. And so I think that they're going to be really up for that game. And I do think that they have the roster to compete, and we can, again, Steve Sarkisian's been a part of putting it together. I think NIL's been a part of putting it together, but they've built the roster, I think, that can compete with Alabama. And I just think that Alabama's got a lot of question marks for me, and I'm a little concerned about what they have going in.
When you look at Texas's team, for me, the big question mark going into 2023 is the defense. I thought they made some really nice gains on that side of the ball in 2022, but a lot of those key pieces are gone, right? You think Coburn and Ajomo up there on the defensive line, Overshown at linebacker, like they lost some veteran guys that were really important to them a season ago. Any concern with Texas's defense when you look at that football team? Is that the biggest question mark you have for them?
So it's a very big question for sure. I think that sort of down-to-down offensive consistency is also a big question for me. That's been something that they've struggled with, and they don't have Bijan Robinson to bail them out anymore. When you look at their finish
Thank
to last
God. I was so good.
No, and so when you look at their finish to last season, and they finished the Big 12 season pretty strong, it was basically Bijan bail us out because we can't do very many things consistently offensively despite all the talent. And, I think Quinn was kind of still dealing with his shoulder injury, but he was not very good to close the year. So that has to get better as well. I think that I like the step that they took from year 1 to year 2 under Pete Kwiatkowski. Obviously, Gary Patterson seemed to get a lot of credit for it. I think that it's a combined effort. I think that Coach K is very good as well on the defensive side of the ball, even with Gary Patterson gone. But I like also the depth that they bring back. I think that they're just going to it's going to be a moderate step, but it's enough of a step, I think, defensively. And you mentioned some of the guys they lost. Well, they bring in the guy in Jalen Catalon at safety, who I'm really excited about. He was a freshman All-American at Arkansas before he dealt with some injuries. If he's able to play, I think he has a chance to be special. Jalen Ford, who I mentioned, might be the best defensive player in the Big 12 at middle linebacker. And on the defensive line, they've built up a lot of depth there. Baron Terrell is somebody who led the team in sacks last year, but I don't think that the defensive line was all that good last year. I think that, they had their moments. They were okay as run stoppers. But, you look at the sack numbers, you look at the pressures, it wasn't an elite unit by any means. I think that they have a chance to be at least a little better than they were last season, even though they might be a little younger. So I have enough faith in the depth that they bring back that it'll give them a baseline. And certainly there's upside there, but I don't think they need to hit it to still be the best team in the Big 12.
All right, Oklahoma. You've got Oklahoma going 9-3.
How dare you?
Well, it's got to be one of the more difficult. You've got a team that's been over the last 20 years more consistent pretty much than anyone else in college football. And then you go 6-7 with the new coach. It's really hard to predict what to expect in that coming year. So what were some of the things that led you to that 9-3?
Yeah. So, when I look at Oklahoma and when I look at this first year for Brent Venables, right, I see a program, like Oklahoma fans have said, that had some issues, right? That whenever the former coaching staff left, I think had some major holes in roster and developments. And they were able to fill some of those last season with transfers and some good young players coming in as well. But I think that it's more than a one-year flip, right? I don't think that this is just a blip. I think it's a build. And so when I looked at Oklahoma, certainly, you have to say they're capable of winning all 12 of their games. Like, I don't think that they're going to be out of any of their 12 games next season. And really that was consistent with last season as well. They lost a lot of close games, but they were competitive in all but one or two of them. And so I think it's going to be like that a lot this year for Oklahoma. But the difference versus say 2021, 2020, even 2019 is I think that they are capable again of beating everybody, but they are also capable of losing to a lot of their teams that they're going to play as well. It's going to be a lot of 50-50 games. I think that there are some limitations at quarterback. I wouldn't be shocked if Jackson Arnold plays them to end the year for them. I think that defensively, again, I expect growth, but this was a bottom 10 defense in the nation last year. And I don't think that it's plugging holes in a little bit of experience away from being good, for example. And so the games that I picked, right, I have them losing against Texas and TCU. I also have them losing at Oklahoma State in the final bedlam. I'm sure some people will have some issue with that. But, I think that when you look at the rest of their schedule, that game at Cincinnati, the Big 12 opener for Cincinnati, that's a dangerous game. Iowa State, I think, could have a chance to be better than people think. At BYU is a tough place to play. UCF coming at home. Like, if you told me that they went 9-3 and I picked all 3 of their losses wrong, I wouldn't be that surprised. So I think that it's going to be a team with a lot of upside that by the end of the year is playing at a high level. But I get, again, just question the consistency that they're going to have this upcoming season, replacing a lot, trying to fill a lot of holes. For me, it's a huge red flag to me that Jeff Levy's system only has really one proven wide receiver who's able to make plays in space. Some more guys can step up, but I'm worried about that. So a lot of good is going to come this season, but I've got a lot of question marks as well.
And I think that's fair. I do. Now, you mentioned it does not sound like you're very high on Dillon Gabriel. And I saw that you put your Big 12 quarterback rankings, tiers, what kind of however you wanted to describe it. But in the top tier, you had Will Howard, Quinn Ewers, and Jalen Daniels. And then in the next tier, you had Tyler Shuck, Hunter Deckers, Chandler Morris, and then Dillon Gabriel. What has you doubting Dillon Gabriel's ability? Like, what are the main reasons behind that?
Sure. So I think that when I look at Dillon Gabriel, obviously a quarterback who does so many things well, I think that his limitations are very well known by Big 12 teams at this point. And the thing that I question most about him is sort of that intermediate game, because I think in this Big 12, with the way that teams play this 3-3-5, you have to be able to win in the intermediate range. And Dillon Gabriel is very much a boomer bust type quarterback. He hits the big shots, and obviously a lot of other stuff is built through the screen game. And I was at Baylor in 2013-14, right? Like I know sort of the intimate ways of how Jeff Levy's offense works, and I think that with Dillon Gabriel, you're talking about somebody who I think can do the big stuff, and the little stuff is what I'm a little more worried about. Can he hit the intermediate stuff? Can he go to the middle of the field? Can he stand in the pocket, right? These are questions that I have about him. And he's entering year 5, I think, as a college football quarterback at this point. I don't think that stuff is likely to get better. So when I look at him, the biggest thing that I have about him is upside. And I think that when I list out the guys ahead of him, they've, I think, been comparably good, but I think have more upside than what Dillon Gabriel might possess at this point.
Now, do you factor in like the skill position guys for that? For example, like Quinn Ewers, he's going to have great skill position guys coming back. He had the same guys a year ago. He doesn't have Bijan Robinson. Like you could realistically make the argument that maybe they're not as good at skill position as they were a year ago. But like Dillon Gabriel, who statistically was far better than Quinn Ewers last year. They went 6-7, but he's like, how do you think his skill position guys factor into that equation?
Yeah. So the way that I'd frame it is, how able are these quarterbacks able to do what their team needs them to do within their system, right? And so I think that when you look at Oklahoma's system, it puts a lot on the quarterback. It makes them make difficult throws and makes them make throws down the sideline. And yes, certainly when you look at Oklahoma's receiver, the situation this upcoming year, that is a red flag for me. And I think that, look, if you're asking me who had a better 2022, like Dillon Gabriel had a better 2022 than Quinn Ewers, but I think that Quinn Ewers is more prepared to do the things that Texas needs to do to have a high level offense, because of, one, what they ask him to do, two, certainly what they have in their system. I mean, again, if you're asking like, who would you take to start your team? I don't know that Will Howard is my number one, but what he's going to be asked to do in that Kansas State system and the effectiveness that he's played with in the Big 12 is why I have him number one, for example.